The sky above Western Germany was a hard, frozen blue. It was early 1944, and for Luftwaffe pilots, the horizon itself had become a measure of survival. Each morning, they climbed into their cockpits with a ritualized confidence born of experience. The air above the Reich was still their domain, or so they believed. They had seen countless bomber formations before. The heavy contrails stretched for miles, the great silver columns of B-17s and B-24s shimmering in the thin light, droning towards cities whose names had long since lost meaning. Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, Hamburg. Places that existed now only as coordinates, targets, or smoldering ruins. The German pilots had fought them for years. They knew the rhythm of it, the distant hum growing into a deep, thunderous pulse, the rising altitudes, the sharp bursts of light when their 20 mm cannons struck home. Then, when their ammunition ran dry or the fuel gauge dipped dangerously low, they would peel away and dive for the safety of home fields scattered across the Reich. The bombers could come this far, but the American escort fighters never could. Until that day. From the western sky, beyond the range they had considered impossible, came a formation of sleek silver shapes, cutting through the cold air with unnerving confidence. Their silhouettes were unfamiliar. Long noses, wide wings, and a strange gleam along the fuselage that caught the sunlight differently from any fighter they had faced before. At first, the German pilots assumed they were Spitfires, perhaps operating from forward bases in France. But that was impossible. The distance was far too great. The bombers were over central Germany now, hundreds of miles from the English Channel. No Allied fighter could possibly escort them here. None had ever done so. Then, one of the new planes banked sharply into the sunlight, its radiator scoop flashing beneath the fuselage, and a chill went through the German formation. It was the new American fighter, the one they had heard rumors about in the officers' mess, the one that was supposed to be able to cross the channel, fight, and still come home. The P51 Mustang, its pilot lined up on a Messerschmitt that had just finished a head-on pass at the bombers. The German pilot instinctively pulled into a dive, expecting to lose the pursuit as he always had before. But the Mustang stayed with him, its Merlin engine howling through the cold air. The dive steepened, and the German watched in disbelief as the American fighter matched his descent effortlessly, closing the distance with terrifying precision. When the tracers finally reached him, they came not from above or ahead, but from behind, deep inside what had always been his sanctuary, the long flight home. For the first time, German pilots were being hunted over their own skies. That day, the Luftwaffe realized the war in the air had changed forever. The shock spread through airfields and headquarters like a quiet contagion. Reports came in from multiple Gruppen. New American fighters had been sighted as far east as Brunswick and Leipzig. They stayed with the bombers all the way to the target, then turned on the interceptors during their withdrawal. Squadrons that had grown used to attacking unescorted formations now found themselves facing agile, relentless escorts that seemed to appear out of nowhere. No one could quite explain it. The distances were impossible. Allied fighters should have run out of fuel long before reaching German airspace. Yet the Mustangs were there, fighting at 25,000 feet over central Germany, then following the bombers all the way back toward the North Sea. That evening, when surviving pilots landed at their scattered fields, the pattern was the same. Each one climbed from his cockpit with disbelief written on his face. Some muttered about British trickery or a new refueling method. Others stared at the setting sun in silence, knowing instinctively what it meant. For years, they had enjoyed one last comfort. When the fight was over, the flight home was theirs alone. Now even that had been taken from them. In a few short weeks, the name Mustang would spread through every Luftwaffe briefing room. It would appear in the combat diaries of Jagdgeschwader 26 and Jagdgeschwader 54, in the terse radio logs of bomber interception units, and in the frightened letters of young pilots writing home to families they would never see again. The P-51 was not merely another aircraft. It was the arrival of inevitability, the embodiment of Allied industrial might, technical refinement, and strategic patience converging at last in the sky. For the German fighter arm, it marked the beginning of the end. By mid-1943, the skies over Europe had become a vast and terrible battlefield. The 8th Air Force was still young then, and its commanders carried a dangerous conviction that precision daylight bombing, carried out in tight formation by heavily armed bombers, could cripple the German war machine without the need for long-range escort fighters. It was a doctrine born from optimism, sustained by mathematics, and paid for in blood. Every morning, the great airfields of East Anglia shook beneath the roar of engines. B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators rose into the sky by the hundreds, forming into immense aerial armadas that stretched for miles. They climbed through the cloud banks of the English coast and crossed the Channel in perfect symmetry, believing their collective firepower would keep the Luftwaffe at bay. At first, it almost worked. Against limited opposition, the bombers proved devastating. Factories in France, shipyards in the Netherlands, and railway yards in Belgium burned under their assault. But as the bomber formations pushed deeper into the continent, beyond the reach of their limited fighter escorts, the illusion of invulnerability began to collapse. The British Spitfires and American P-47 Thunderbolts that rose to meet them each morning were formidable in combat but short-legged. Their endurance was measured in minutes once over enemy territory. Spitfires could patrol barely 100 miles beyond the coast before fuel gauges forced them home. The early P-47s could escort the bombers only as far as Antwerp or Brussels. Beyond that invisible line, the bombers were on their own. The Luftwaffe understood this limitation with deadly clarity. German radar stations watched each incoming formation cross the channel. Controllers plotted their routes on glass plotting tables, timing their response with surgical precision. They knew exactly when the escort fighters would turn back, and it was then, always then, that they launched the interceptors. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s climbed to altitude, coordinated by ground controllers, and descended on the unescorted bombers in wave after wave. It became a ritual slaughter. In the summer and autumn of 1943, the American 8th Air Force suffered losses that no Air Force could sustain indefinitely. On August 17th, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, 376 bombers went out. 60 were lost. 600 men vanished in a single day. Those who survived returned to find airfields lined with empty revetments and the silence of absence where engines once roared. The morale of the bomber crews began to crumble. They watched squadron photographs go out of date each week. Faces were replaced by new ones, fresh from training schools in Texas and Oklahoma, men who didn't yet know the odds stacked against them. The Luftwaffe, though strained, still possessed experienced pilots, many with hundreds of combat missions behind them. They were defending their homeland now, flying from fields carved into the forests and meadows of the Reich. To them, the daily battle overhead was not an abstract campaign of attrition. It was personal, and it was home. General Eaker, commanding the 8th Air Force, pressed for a solution. He wrote to Washington that our bomber losses are reaching a point where the offensive cannot be maintained unless long-range fighter escort is provided. Engineers scrambled to modify existing designs. They experimented with drop tanks for P-47s, additional fuel cells for Spitfires, even hybrid conversions of twin-engine aircraft. Each attempt bought a few dozen extra miles, but none offered the reach needed to escort bombers to Germany and back. The strategic calculus was stark. Without protection, the daylight bombing campaign risked collapse. Without the bombing campaign, there could be no effective invasion of Europe. And without that invasion, there would be no victory. It was in this climate of desperation that a quiet transformation began in the background, one that no one, not even its creators, could have foreseen would alter the balance of air power completely. The story began years earlier, across the Atlantic, in the offices of North American Aviation. In 1940, the British had approached the company with a request: build more Curtiss P-40s under license. But the company's chief designer, Edgar Schmood, proposed something bolder. Rather than produce an aging model, North American would design a new fighter from the ground up, built for speed, range, and efficiency. They called it the NA-73X, the prototype that would become the Mustang. At first, it was purely a British project. Early Mustangs used the Allison engine, which limited their performance at high altitude. The Royal Air Force appreciated its low-level speed and agility, using it mainly for reconnaissance and ground attack, but it was unsuited for high-altitude combat where the bomber war was fought. Then came the transformation that changed everything. The marriage of American airframe and British power plant. Engineers installed the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same heart that drove the Spitfire. Overnight, the Mustang evolved from a low-level tactical fighter into a high-altitude thoroughbred. Its range was unmatched, its climb rate exceptional, and its speed rivaled the best fighters in the world. By late 1943, the U.S. Army Air Forces began testing the new P51B Mustang in England. Pilots who flew it for the first time came down grinning, aware that something extraordinary had just been born. One test report summed it up simply: the Mustang is the answer. In January 1944, the first Mustang squadrons began escorting American bombers over Germany. That month, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot, returning from a mission near Bremen, reported an alarming sight: new American fighters operating at great distance. The report was forwarded to higher command. It was noted, but not yet believed. Within weeks, disbelief would turn to dread. The Allies had found their sword of the sky, and the Luftwaffe was about to discover what it meant to face an enemy that could follow them all the way home. In the winter of 1943, the skies above Germany carried a deceptive calm. On the ground, airfields from Münster to Magdeburg were slick with frost and exhaustion. Pilots of the Luftwaffe's Jagdgeschwader squadrons, JG-1, JG-2, JG-26, JG-54, prepared for another day of intercepting the endless bomber streams that came from the west. The routine had become painfully familiar. Radar stations near the coast would sound the alarm. Controllers in underground bunkers would vector interceptors toward the incoming formations. Within minutes, dozens of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s would lift into the cold air, engines coughing blue smoke before clearing their throats to a smooth roar. They still held confidence in one unshakable fact: the Americans might bomb deep, but their fighters could not follow. Once the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings turned for home over Belgium, the air war reverted to the Germans. That was their window, the precious half-hour when the bombers were alone and exposed. It was in this narrow band of expectation that the world changed. On December 1st, 1943, bomber crews returning from a mission to Solingen reported something extraordinary. "We had fighter cover over the target," one crew wrote in disbelief, "and all the way home." The claim was dismissed by many as confusion or luck. But similar reports came again and again throughout the month. Fighter escort at Brunswick, fighter escort at Bremen, fighter escort beyond the Weser River. The 8th Air Force intelligence officers cross-checked the details and realized something unprecedented had happened. Their new Mustang units had successfully escorted bombers deeper into Germany than any Allied fighter had ever gone. For the Luftwaffe, the first encounters with the P-51 came as a shock. In early January 1944, pilots of JG-11 and JG-2 began to encounter American fighters at altitudes and ranges previously thought impossible. At first, they mistook them for P-47 Thunderbolts with drop tanks, an understandable error given the similar silver sheen at a distance. But as combat closed, the illusion shattered. The new American fighter was faster in level flight, climbed higher, and turned sharper. Its engine note was distinctive, a deep, rolling growl that built into a howl at full throttle. When a Mustang latched onto a target, it stayed there. One German pilot, Oberleutnant Wilhelm Batz of JG-52, recorded his first impression with characteristic precision. It came from nowhere, and it did not leave. Our planes could no longer outrun them in the dive. Even at full speed, it stayed behind as if tied by a rope. What astonished the Luftwaffe most was not just performance, but persistence. The Mustang seemed to appear everywhere, over Bremen, Kassel, even as far as the outskirts of Berlin. Pilots who had grown accustomed to slipping away after their attack runs now found the Americans waiting for them on the return flight. For years, the Luftwaffe's greatest advantage had been control of distance. Their homeland defense units could strike and vanish, knowing their pursuers lacked the range to follow. Now, that sanctuary dissolved in a matter of weeks. In mid-January, during a mission to Oschersleben, a formation of FW-190s dived into a bomber stream as they had done countless times before. They struck hard, sending several B-17s down in flames, But as they climbed away, Mustangs pounced from altitude, slashing through the formation in disciplined pairs. The engagement lasted minutes. 3 German fighters were destroyed before they even realized what they were facing. When the survivors returned, their squadron leader wrote in his report, "Enemy escort fighters followed our retreat past Hanover. This has never occurred before." By February, panic had begun to set in. Luftwaffe intelligence officers gathered photographs from gun cameras and reconnaissance films. They studied the unfamiliar silhouette, its broad laminar flow wing, its sharp nose, its ventral scoop, and identified it as the North American P51B. The technical notes circulated quietly among squadrons. Range 1,800 kilometers. Ceiling over 40,000 feet. Armament 6 50 caliber machine guns. The last line carried a kind of fatalism. Those guns had already become a familiar sight in combat films, glowing streaks cutting through the air with mechanical precision. Pilots began referring to it simply as Die Mustang. At first, there was a disbelief that bordered on denial. Veteran aces insisted the reports were exaggerated, that no single-engine fighter could cover such distance. But the losses mounted. By March, the Luftwaffe had entered what they privately called the Season of Iron Rain. The Mustangs, operating in growing numbers, now escorted bombers to Berlin itself. On March 4, 1944, for the first time, P-51s covered B-17s all the way to the German capital and back. It was a moment of symbolic rupture, the day the Luftwaffe realized there was no longer any refuge. That evening, when General Adolf Galland read the mission reports, he understood the implications immediately. Galland, a veteran of the Battle of Britain and inspector of fighters, had seen the tide of war shift before. He summoned his senior officers and spoke quietly. "If this is confirmed, we have lost the war of attrition." He was not speaking metaphorically. The Luftwaffe's veteran corps, the men who had survived since 1939, was being ground away. They were flying more sorties than ever before against an enemy that no longer grew tired or turned for home. Every engagement now risked loss not only over enemy territory but above their own bases. Even victory in the sky meant little if they were shot down on the return leg. The P-51 had taken away their most precious weapon, time. The strategic meaning of those first encounters was immense. Each German pilot lost was irreplaceable. Each Mustang lost was easily replaced by the vast industrial power of America. Factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, produced new Mustangs by the hundreds each month. For every aircraft destroyed, another took its place within weeks, crewed by fresh pilots trained with relentless efficiency. The Luftwaffe could not compete with that scale. And so, in the frozen skies of early 1944, as vapor trails crossed above the Reich and the sun burned weakly through the haze, the balance of air power shifted for good. The hunters of Europe had just become the hunted. When historians describe the P-51 Mustang, they often speak in terms of legend. But legends are born from detail, precision of design, ingenuity of engineering, and the relentless solving of a single problem that others considered impossible. For the Allies, that problem had always been distance. The bomber war over Europe depended not on courage or even firepower, but on fuel, range, and endurance. A fighter that could accompany bombers from English airfields to the industrial heart of Germany and back would mean the difference between sustained assault and unsustainable loss. For years, no one had built such a machine. The P-51 was the first to do it. To understand its significance, one must first see it as its engineers did. A solution, not a miracle. In 1940, when North American aviation began work on the new fighter, they approached it not as an aircraft designer's dream, but as a mathematician's equation. Every inch of the Mustang's frame was drawn around the question of efficiency. Its wing was not conventional but revolutionary. A laminar flow design that delayed the onset of turbulence, reducing drag at high speeds. Air flowed smoothly over its surface, giving the Mustang an almost liquid grace in flight and extending its range far beyond what any other fighter could achieve. The cockpit sat low and centered, the nose long, the canopy framed like the brow of a predator. Beneath that nose rested its greatest secret, the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This 1,400 horsepower V-12 was a transatlantic hybrid, a British design produced under American precision manufacturing. The engine transformed the Mustang's character completely. Where the earlier Allison-powered models had struggled above 15,000 feet, the Merlin variant soared beyond 30,000. Its supercharger allowed full power at high altitudes, the very domain where the bomber war was fought. The combination of the Mustang's aerodynamic purity and the Merlin's power-to-weight ratio produced a fighter that could climb faster, fly farther, and fight longer than anything the Luftwaffe could send against it. But what made the Mustang truly terrifying to its enemies was not just its speed, it was its range. Fitted with internal fuel tanks totaling 269 gallons and two external drop tanks that could carry an additional 150 gallons each, the P51 could fly over 1 to 800 miles under ideal conditions. In practice, this meant that a Mustang could take off from a base in southern England, climb to altitude over the Channel, rendezvous with bomber formations near the Dutch coast, escort them to Berlin and back, and still have enough fuel for combat along the way. The implications of that were immense. For the first time, the 8th Air Force could plan raids deep into the Reich with the assurance that their bombers would not be left defenseless halfway home. Commanders could schedule missions to Augsburg, Munich, and even Vienna with fighter protection throughout the flight. In strategic terms, it meant that the Luftwaffe's homeland air defense system, once so finely tuned to the bomber's limits, was suddenly obsolete. Even more remarkable was how easily the Mustang could operate in combat. Pilots who transitioned to the P-51 from older aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt or P-38 Lightning described it as effortless. It responded like an extension of the body. Its controls were smooth and precise. The cockpit visibility was excellent, and the range meant pilots no longer had to nurse the throttle with constant fear of fuel exhaustion. It was, in short, a fighter built to reach the war itself. The Luftwaffe's own pilots quickly recognized its advantages in the air. The Mustang could outdive the Bf-109 and outturn the FW-190. Its 6 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, mounted symmetrically in the wings, created a stream of fire so dense that even a brief burst could shred a target. The ammunition belts contained armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds, each chosen for specific effects against aircraft frames, fuel tanks, and engines. German after-action reports often mentioned the same pattern: a flash of silver in the sun, a short burst, and an entire wing or fuselage erupting in flames. But the true terror for German pilots lay in the Mustang's persistence. Even when they escaped, they could never be certain the chase was over. The P-51's range allowed it to follow them for hundreds of miles, even as far as the edges of their home airfields. It was no longer possible to dive away toward safety or rely on fuel to separate the combatants. In the words of one Luftwaffe veteran, Oberleutnant Karl-Heinz Ossenkopf, "We used to watch our fuel gauges and know that when the enemy turned back, we had survived another day. Then came the Mustang. It did not turn back. It followed." On the Allied side, the Mustang's arrival was like the lifting of a curse. Bomber crews who had once flown into Germany with clenched jaws and fatalistic prayers now looked out their windows to see gleaming fighters flying beside them, even over the target. The sight of those silver wings was more than reassurance. It was a promise that someone would be waiting to bring them home. It was common for bomber crews to count the Mustangs by sight as they crossed into enemy territory, each one a silent guardian. The gunners gave them nicknames. "Little friends," they called them. It became a phrase whispered with a kind of superstition. The little friends are with us today. For the first time in 2 years, morale aboard the bombers rose. The statistics soon followed. Loss rates fell sharply, mission success climbed, and the Luftwaffe's kill ratio began to invert. The balance of attrition, the great invisible tide that determined the outcome of air wars, had begun to flow inexorably toward the Allies. The Germans tried to adapt. New tactics, new aircraft, new formations. But it was like trying to outswim a tide that had already turned. And beneath it all was one simple fact of engineering: a fighter that could go the distance. From a design table in California to the skies over Berlin, The P-51 Mustang had achieved what no air force in history had done before. It had erased distance itself as a weapon. By February 1944, the Luftwaffe was fighting not only the enemy above the clouds, but the impossible mathematics of exhaustion. For years, they had dominated the skies through discipline, technology, and experience. But wars fought in the air obey no tradition. They are won by altitude, by speed, and by time. The P-51 Mustang stole all three at once. German pilots began to notice a new pattern in their daily briefings. The escort coverage line, once safely drawn near the Dutch border, now crept deeper into the map each week. By January, it reached the Rhine. By February, it crossed Hanover. By March, it touched Berlin. And still, it moved east. The Reich's defense zones, once built around distance and interception timing, began to crumble from within. Ground controllers, those unseen men in bunkers who guided the fighters by radar, reported the same phrase again and again. Enemy escorts still present. At first, High Command refused to believe it. Official communiques from the Reich Luftfahrt Ministerium, the Air Ministry, downplayed the situation. They attributed losses to unexpected numerical advantage or temporary overcommitment. But the pilots in the air saw it plainly. The Mustangs were everywhere. In the early morning light, when contrails glowed pink and the frost glittered on the wings, the Luftwaffe's young replacements climbed into cockpits painted with numbers and emblems that had once belonged to men now dead. They fastened their harnesses, closed the canopy, and looked at the sky with silent dread. Among the veterans, the realization came quietly, like a sickness spreading through the squadrons. The enemy had built a machine that could do what theirs could not: fight over Germany itself and win. One of them, Lieutenant Hans Ehlers of JG-1, wrote in his diary in February 1944, "Today we fought the new American fighter again. It stays high, waiting for us. When we break from the bombers, it is already there. We try to dive away, but it follows even at full throttle. It is faster than the 109 and steadier than the 190. There is no escape now. The war has changed." By this time, German airfields resembled graveyards more than fortresses. Mechanics worked through nights repairing aircraft that would be destroyed the next day. Oil shortages, the curse of the entire Wehrmacht, now crippled flying hours. Veteran pilots were ordered to train green recruits who had barely 20 flight hours to their names. It was an impossible task. The average American fighter pilot arriving in England in 1944 had logged over 350 flight hours before his first mission. He had trained on formation combat, deflection shooting, and navigation by instruments. The German replacements, once trained to perfection, now received half that, often less. And the sky showed no mercy for inexperience. When the bombers came, they came in thousands. The horizon filled with silver wings, contrails like white scars stretching from the Channel to the heart of the Reich. The radio crackled with desperate voices, radar vectors, and shouts of contact. The Luftwaffe still fought with courage, but courage had become a finite resource. During the massive Allied offensive known as Big Week in late February 1944, the full horror of the new reality unfolded. From February 20th to 25th, American bombers and their escorts struck aircraft factories across Germany: Augsburg, Regensburg, Gotha, and Leipzig. For 6 days, the sky over central Germany was a constant storm of contrails, flak bursts, and burning fuel. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the defense, over 2,000 fighters. But the Mustang had arrived in strength. P-51s from the 354th, 357th, and 4th Fighter Groups roamed far beyond the bomber formations, sweeping ahead to engage German interceptors before they could even reach the bombers. For the first time, the defenders were being attacked before they could attack. On February 21st, the Jagdgeschwader 26 Schlageter, one of Germany's elite fighter wings, reported losing 12 aircraft in a single afternoon. Their unit log recorded grimly: engagements heavy and continuous. New enemy fighter with extraordinary range and altitude advantage. Losses unsustainable. At the same time, over Gotha, Mustang pilots were discovering a new role for their aircraft: free hunting. Instead of simply escorting bombers, they now ranged independently, cutting through the skies in pairs, searching for targets of opportunity. They strafed airfields, railway lines, and even fuel convoys moving through forest roads. The effect on German logistics was catastrophic. For decades, the Luftwaffe had relied on forward bases close to potential combat zones. Now, even these were no longer safe. When the Mustangs appeared over an airfield, their attacks were swift and brutal. A single pass could destroy rows of parked aircraft and send flames rippling across the tarmac. Photographs from reconnaissance missions show the aftermath. Crumpled fuselages scattered like broken toys, black streaks across snow-covered fields, ground crews staring helplessly at smoking wreckage. The psychological toll was worse. Pilots began taking off already knowing they might never land again. They no longer flew to hunt, they flew to survive. Each mission began with silent calculation: how to climb unseen, how to attack quickly, how to break away before the escorts found them. But the escorts always found them. The Mustangs operated with a calm, disciplined efficiency. They flew in finger four formations, a pattern developed by Finnish and German pilots earlier in the war, but now perfected by the Americans. Each flight covered the other, scanning for threats, striking as one, then disengaging with coordinated precision. German formations, flying in rigid Staffel lines, could not adapt quickly enough. The Luftwaffe's once feared discipline had become its weakness. By spring, the air war had entered a new phase. For the first time since 1939, the Luftwaffe was no longer the hunter, but the prey. In Berlin, staff officers tried to calculate replacement rates and production figures to stem the collapse. They knew the numbers. In 1943, Germany had produced 10,700 aircraft. America produced over 86,000. Every factory destroyed during Big Week widened the gulf further. Gallen's private memo to Reichsmarshal Göring in March 1944 put it plainly: "We are fighting an enemy who has all the cards. They have the range, the altitude, the fuel, and the numbers. Our fighter arm is dying faster than we can bury it." Even Göring, once proud of his Luftwaffe's supremacy, felt the truth closing around him. Months later, as he looked up from his headquarters during an air raid and saw the endless formations of silver bombers escorted by glinting fighters that circled like hawks, he muttered to his adjutant, "When I saw those Mustangs over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." It was not hyperbole, it was prophecy fulfilled in metal and sky. In the cold dawn of February 20th, 1944, England's airfields awoke to a sound that no soldier or civilian could ever forget. It was the thunder of engines, hundreds upon hundreds of them, rolling across the frozen grass. Pilots moved through the mist like ghosts, ground crews shouting above the roar, propellers flashing in rhythmic arcs of sunlight. The air smelled of fuel and winter and inevitability. They were preparing for what the planners called Operation Argument. The crews simply called it Big Week. For 6 days, the Allied air forces would strike at the heart of German aircraft production. Their targets were not cities, not ports, not railways, but the factories themselves. The lifeblood of the Luftwaffe. Messerschmitt at Regensburg, Focke-Wulf at Gotha, Heinkel at Rostock. Every plant that built a fighter to defend the Reich would be hit, no matter the cost. The concept had been born in desperation. Allied intelligence knew the Luftwaffe was losing ground, but not fast enough. The German fighter force had to be broken completely, its production crippled and its veteran corps annihilated. The risk was monumental. It meant sending bombers into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. But for the first time, they would not go alone. Over the airfields of East Anglia, the P51 Mustang stood ready. Their polished wings caught the sunrise like mirrors. Painted with the bright squadron markings of the 4th, 357th, and 3M54th fighter groups, they represented something entirely new in modern warfare: the long-range sword of air supremacy. As the first bomber formations climbed out over the North Sea, hundreds of Mustangs took position alongside them, engines humming in perfect synchrony. They would escort the bombers all the way, to the heart of Germany and back. At the same moment, across the Reich, the sirens began to wail. Radar stations in Holland and northern Germany lit up with the tracks of incoming raids. The scope of the attack stunned even the most seasoned controllers. Dozens of formations, each composed of hundreds of bombers, stretched across the radar screen in an unbroken arc from Denmark to the Ardennes. "Feindverband gross," one controller reported. "Enemy formation, large." From airfields near Hanover, Kassel, and Brunswick, the Luftwaffe scrambled everything that could still fly. F-190s roared down narrow runways, their propellers kicking up snow and mud. Bf-109s climbed steeply toward the glinting horizon. Among them were veterans who had fought since the Battle of Britain and young recruits who had never seen combat. They met the bombers over the Weser River and met the Mustangs with them. It was chaos. The P-51s struck like falcons, diving from the sun, their 6 guns flashing white heat. The Germans, expecting to find unescorted bombers, suddenly found themselves trapped between walls of 50 caliber fire. The air filled with smoke trails and shattered canopies. Parachutes bloomed like gray flowers against the sky. One Mustang pilot of the 357th Fighter Group, Lieutenant Clarence "Bud" Anderson, later described the scene. You couldn't look anywhere without seeing someone going down. It was like the whole sky was on fire. You'd roll, dive, shoot, and before you could even climb again, there'd be another one in your sights. For the Luftwaffe, Big Week became a massacre. In 6 days of fighting, they lost nearly 600 aircraft and, far worse, more than 100 of their most experienced pilots. The German pilot corps had always been its greatest strength. These men, Hartmann, Barkhorn, Rahl, Galland, had been flying since the first campaigns in Poland and France. They carried experience that no training program could replace, but now, for the first time, they were being destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Every victory the Luftwaffe scored came at the price of 2 or 3 losses of their own, and every pilot lost represented not just an aircraft but years of irreplaceable knowledge. The Americans, meanwhile, had replacements waiting in endless lines. Training schools across the United States produced thousands of new pilots every month. For every Mustang shot down, another took off from an airfield in Texas or Florida within weeks. The imbalance was terminal. By the end of Big Week, the German Fighter Command reported severe disorganization of defensive capability. Fuel shortages compounded the chaos. Factories hit by the bombing campaign could not produce new aircraft quickly enough. Replacement engines lay buried under rubble. Assembly lines stood silent. One of the few surviving reports from the Messerschmitt plant at Regensburg reads like a death certificate. Production halted indefinitely. Power supply destroyed. Entire East Hall burned. 40% of personnel casualties. The Allies lost bombers too, heavy losses that shocked commanders. But the balance of attrition had shifted decisively. For every bomber that fell, 10 new fighters were destroyed on the German side. The Luftwaffe's ability to defend its own airspace had been permanently broken. From that point forward, the skies over Germany would never again belong to Germany. The impact went far beyond the factories. The morale of the Luftwaffe collapsed. Veterans who had once boasted of flying for the Führer now spoke only of survival. Young recruits approached takeoff with trembling hands. They knew that the odds of returning were shrinking with each passing week. In one of the last coherent diary entries from a JG-54 pilot written during Big Week, he recorded a moment of stark realization. The sky belongs to them now. It is as if we fight under occupation. The phrase spread quietly among pilots. The occupied sky. It was bitter irony, spoken in mess halls and on airfields littered with the wreckage of yesterday's sortie. Even the once confident Reichsmarschall Göring began to sense the inevitable. He raged at his staff, accusing them of cowardice and incompetence, but his fury rang hollow. Reports from across the Reich told the same story: losses, shortages, and the constant hum of Allied bombers overhead. When the Americans struck again in March, Göring ordered a personal inspection flight. From his observation aircraft, he looked down upon the contrails of hundreds of Mustangs glinting in the sunlight, escorting the bombers deep into Germany. He turned to his aide and whispered words that would be remembered for decades. "If I had the Mustang, I would have conquered the world." It was not admiration. It was surrender. By the time Big Week ended, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of itself. Entire squadrons had ceased to exist. Others limped along with a handful of pilots and patched-up aircraft. The once fearsome fighter force that had dominated Europe from 1939 to 1942 was now fighting a hopeless rearguard war against an enemy that no longer tired, no longer turned back, and no longer feared them. The death spiral had begun. By the spring of 1944, the balance of the air war had reversed completely. For the first time since 1939, the skies over Europe were no longer a contested frontier. They were an Allied domain. The Luftwaffe still fought, still killed, still claimed victories, but its power was fading, consumed by the very machine it had once built. And into that void came the men of the Mustang groups, pilots who no longer saw themselves as mere escorts, but as hunters. The 8th Air Force gave them new orders: seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever it hides. It was a profound shift in doctrine. For years, Allied fighters had been reactive, defending bombers, intercepting attacks, waiting for the enemy to strike. Now, with range and numbers on their side, they could go on the offensive. Each morning, squadrons of Mustangs took off ahead of the bomber streams, fanning out across the continent like a great silver tide. They swept over airfields, roads, and rail yards, looking for anything that moved. Their call signs filled the airwaves. Blue flight, tally-ho. Red leader, 2 bandits at 2 o'clock. Yellow section, fuel trucks near Castle. From above, the landscape of Germany unfolded like a map of targets. Roads wound through forests. Rivers reflected the glare of morning light. Below them, Luftwaffe bases lay scattered across meadows and pine fields, once safe under the illusion of distance. That illusion was gone. A typical Mustang strike came without warning. 2 flights, sometimes 3, would dive out of the high clouds in pairs, throttles wide open, guns armed. They flew so low that treetops bent beneath the slipstream. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel trucks exploded, and parked aircraft became fountains of burning metal. Within minutes, the airfield would be a ruin of smoke and fire. Then they climbed again, not to retreat, but to hunt the survivors. Pilots called these missions fighter sweeps, though among themselves they used another term. Whispered, half in pride, half in disbelief, freie Jagd, free hunt. It was a term once used by the Luftwaffe during their own days of dominance, now taken by the Americans as a declaration that the sky had changed hands. The P51's agility made it lethal even at low altitude. The Merlin engine's smooth power delivery allowed for tight, precise turns that few German fighters could match near the deck. And when it climbed like nothing else in the sky. German pilots soon realized that altitude no longer guaranteed safety. The Mustang could catch them above 30,000 feet, dive through their formations, and still have fuel to chase them all the way to the ground. One Luftwaffe veteran, Feldwebel Otto Clausen, recalled the helplessness. You would see them first as dots, high above, maybe sunlight on metal. Then, before you could climb, they were already behind you. We could not outturn them. We could not outdive them. It was like fighting ghosts. The Mustangs operated in pairs, one covering high while the other attacked. Their teamwork, drilled endlessly in training, gave them an advantage the Luftwaffe could no longer match. German formations often broke apart under the first pass, each pilot fighting for his own survival while the Mustangs moved with calm precision. The skies that had once echoed with the harsh chatter of German radios now filled with the smooth, measured voices of American pilots. Blue 2, I'm on him. Copy, Bluelet. I see your fire. Splash 1190. The language of combat had changed, but the outcome was always the same. One more German fighter spiraling down, one more black column of smoke rising from a distant field. Every Mustang pilot carried his own story into the war. Some were farm boys from Kansas or Iowa who had never seen Europe before. Others were college athletes, engineers, or mechanics. What united them was the machine beneath them, a plane that seemed to defy every limit they had been taught. To them, the Mustang was not just a weapon. It was freedom itself. It could outfly, outfight, and outrun anything they had ever known. Pilots spoke of it with a kind of reverence. One said, "It didn't fly, it was in the eye. It went where you thought." They began to recognize one another by call sign. Jaeger, Anderson, Blakesley, Gentile, Preddy, Meyer. Names that would echo long after the war ended. They became legends not because of numbers or medals, but because of what they represented. Men who turned the tide in a war fought miles above the earth. Their missions were exhausting, sometimes lasting 7 or 8 hours. The cockpit would grow unbearably cold at altitude, frost forming on the canopy. The roar of the Merlin became a kind of companion, constant and reassuring. The smell of gun oil and oxygen filled the air. Some pilots tied good luck charms to their instrument panels: a photograph, a medal, a playing card. Others carried nothing at all. When the engagement came, it happened in seconds. Two contrails intersecting, a flash of light, a streak of tracers, a sudden explosion that left no trace of the man inside. At the debriefing tables back in England, the reports blurred together. Two 190s destroyed, one probable. Encountered heavy flak over Leipzig. Lost Blue 3 on the return. Yet behind each entry lay a human heartbeat. A friend, a rival, a man who had climbed into the same cold sky and not come back. By May 1944, the Mustang groups had achieved the impossible. The Luftwaffe's daytime strength over Germany had been broken. Its aces were dead or grounded, its replacements untrained. German aircraft factories, already crippled by Big Week, now struggled under constant attack. Every attempt to rebuild was met by another wave of silver wings. The Mustang had achieved what no bomber, no doctrine, and no promise could: absolute air superiority. Even German civilians began to notice the change. Farmers looked up from their fields to see contrails drifting eastward every morning and westward every evening, unopposed. Children collected shell casings that fell from the sky. Townspeople whispered that the Americans now owned the heavens. It was true. By June, the Luftwaffe had been pushed back into the very heart of its homeland, its pilots flying fewer sorties each week, its fuel reserves almost gone. Allied intelligence called it the silent collapse. But for the men in the air, it did not feel silent. It felt like victory measured in heartbeats, in the deep pulse of the Merlin engine carrying them home through the clouds. They had come to Europe as escorts. They were leaving it as conquerors. By the summer of 1944, the war in the air had become an unending dirge. The same sky, the same smoke, the same dwindling circle of survival. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of a nation, was now a bleeding shadow of its former power. And yet, every morning, young men still strapped themselves into cockpits that smelled of oil, sweat, and desperation, still lifted from runways carved into meadows, still climbed toward the silver horizon that had become their grave. For these pilots, defeat did not come in speeches or maps or statistics. It came as a shape in the sky, long-nosed, silver, with that telltale scoop beneath the fuselage, the P51 Mustang. By mid-1944, its presence was constant. German pilots could no longer take off without scanning the horizon for them. They appeared in pairs, sometimes fours, distant flashes of sunlight that seemed to close the distance impossibly fast. Even before combat began, they felt hunted. And in truth, they were. The Allied command had changed its tactics completely. The Mustangs were no longer escorts alone, they were now the cutting edge of an air war of annihilation. Their mission was clear: destroy the Luftwaffe utterly, wherever it flew, wherever it hid. Every airfield within range was fair game. Every train carrying aviation fuel was a target. Every hangar, every truck, every radar van, every flak emplacement, all fell beneath the crosshairs of the Mustangs. They struck at dawn, at noon, at dusk. There was no rhythm to their attacks, no pattern to anticipate. One day they would sweep over Bavaria, the next, Saxony or Thuringia. The Luftwaffe's command structure, once meticulous and precise, now existed only on paper. Mechanics worked under constant threat. Ground crews slept beside their aircraft, waiting for alarms that came almost daily. In the chaos, fuel shortages became critical. It was common for pilots to take off with barely enough gasoline for 30 minutes of flight. The result was inevitable. The Germans began to lose planes not in combat, but simply trying to reach altitude. There are stories recorded in surviving diaries, their handwriting uneven, words blotted by grease and fatigue. One reads, "We had no fuel. We climbed slowly. I could see them already above us. Silver, gleaming, So many of them. Before we could form up, they were upon us. We never had a chance. I saw Franz go down before I could even fire. Another, from a 19-year-old pilot named Dieter of JG 300, ends abruptly. We are flying again tomorrow. Maybe they will not come. Maybe. He was killed the next morning. For the American pilots, the victories came faster than they could be recorded. Gun camera footage from the period shows the ruthless precision of their attacks. Messerschmitts caught during takeoff, flak positions torn apart by strafing runs, trains erupting into sheets of flame. It was the industrial logic of modern war reduced to its most personal form. Every trigger pull ended not just an aircraft but a human story. A boy who had joined to defend his homeland, a man who had once believed in victory, now burning in the cockpit of a plane that could not match its pursuer. And yet, for all their success, the Mustang pilots were not immune to the cost. The missions were long and exhausting. They flew for hours at freezing altitudes, often navigating by dead reckoning through clouds, flak, and haze. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. The constant tension of scanning the sky for threats left them hollow and sleepless. Even victory carried a strange silence. When they returned to their base, the laughter and bravado faded quickly. Each empty bunk told its own story. Major John C. Meyer, commander of the 487th Fighter Squadron, wrote in his diary, "You stop counting the ones you lose. You stop asking who. You just look at the empty places in the mess hall and know." The Luftwaffe, meanwhile, was collapsing from within. By August 1944, pilot losses had reached a level from which recovery was mathematically impossible. The average lifespan of a new German fighter pilot was 11 days. Entire training classes vanished within a month of reaching the front. The veterans, the men who had survived Spain, France, and Russia, were gone. Those who remained flew with injuries, exhaustion, or despair. In late August, during the Allied advance toward Paris, one Luftwaffe staff officer described the state of the Air Force in a confidential report. "We no longer possess a fighting arm in the true sense. The aircraft exist, but without fuel, without pilots, and without spirit. The men climb into their planes as if into coffins." By then, the Mustangs had taken on a new kind of mission. Not just destruction, but domination. They escorted every bombing raid across the continent, patrolled invasion beaches during D-Day, and prowled the skies over retreating German forces in France. They strafed convoys, cut rail lines, and blasted bridges. There was no front line they did not reach. To the German soldier on the ground, the sight of a Mustang was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Its sound, that deep rising wail of the Merlin engine, became synonymous with death from above. Soldiers would dive for cover at the first hint of that tone, knowing that strafing runs often came in pairs, the second fighter arriving seconds after the first. For civilians, it was even more complex. Many had once watched the Luftwaffe climb proudly into the sky from their local airfields, symbols of national strength. Now they watched from basements as the same airfields burned, as the bombers thundered overhead, as the once invincible Eagle fell in flames. The war in the air had become a mirror of the war on the ground, a struggle no longer for victory but for endurance. By autumn, even Göring's reports to Hitler had taken on a tone of resignation. He wrote in September 1944, "Our fighter arm is disintegrating. The enemy dominates the air. Every new aircraft we produce is destroyed before it can fly its first mission. I cannot guarantee air defense of the Reich." He was right. By October, the Luftwaffe was functionally broken. What few planes it could still put into the sky flew on borrowed time, and borrowed fuel. The P51s hunted them mercilessly. It was a war of attrition that had no mercy left to give. In a sky once ruled by German wings, the Mustang now reigned alone. A machine that had not only conquered its enemy, but defined the meaning of air supremacy itself. The dawn of June 6, 1944, broke over the English Channel, with a weight history would never forget. The sea below churned with ships, an armada so vast it seemed to defy geography itself. Thousands of vessels crept toward the Normandy coast, each carrying men who would decide the fate of Europe. Above them, the sky filled with a sound more powerful than thunder, The steady, endless hum of Allied aircraft. Bombers, transports, gliders, and among them, weaving like silver blades in the rising sun, the P51 Mustangs. For weeks leading up to D-Day, the Mustang groups had flown ceaselessly, cutting away the Luftwaffe's last means of defense. They destroyed airfields across France and Belgium, strafed trains carrying fuel, and hunted every aircraft that dared to rise. They severed the arteries of the German air system so completely that, by the time the invasion came, the sky above Normandy belonged entirely to the Allies. On that morning, the Luftwaffe's absence was almost eerie. German anti-aircraft gunners fired blindly into the sky, but few German fighters appeared. Their silence was as eloquent as any victory speech. The force that had once terrorized Europe with the scream of Stukas and the precision of Messerschmitts was gone. And the Mustangs were the reason. They flew in tight formations over the beaches, engines roaring above the thunder of artillery and surf. Their role was both guardian and predator, to protect the invasion fleet from any surviving Luftwaffe attack and to strike at any movement behind German lines. At dawn, they swept inland, strafing convoys, rail junctions, and columns of German armor moving toward the beaches. Farmers across Normandy watched them pass in pairs, sunlight flashing off their canopies, each pass followed by the rising plume of smoke from a destroyed truck or tank. In radio logs from that day, pilots of the 352nd and 357th Fighter Groups could barely keep up with their own reports. Convoy destroyed near Argenton. 2 tanks burning south of Caen. Multiple contacts near Lisieux. All destroyed. By mid-morning, the skies over Normandy were an American domain. Pilots reported seeing the invasion fleet stretching across the sea from horizon to horizon. Below them, tens of thousands of men fought for each foot of sand, knowing that above them, no German aircraft dared to challenge. The Luftwaffe did appear, briefly. A few desperate Fu-90s and Bf-109s scrambled from bases near Paris and Amiens, but they never reached the beaches. Mustangs intercepted them before they crossed the Seine. Within minutes, they were gone. Some shot down, others retreating into cloud banks, chased by the same hunters who had followed them all year. The Battle of Normandy was not just fought on the beaches. It was fought in the skies, and it was won long before the first soldier set foot on French soil. In the weeks that followed, the P-51s became the sword and shield of the Allied advance. They flew constant patrols over the front lines, sweeping ahead of the troops like invisible scouts. They cut German supply columns to pieces, attacked bridges and rail yards, and isolated entire divisions from resupply. Each day, as the Allies pushed deeper into France, the Mustangs pushed farther east. They followed the front like a shadow, landing at hastily built airstrips in the fields of Normandy, then at new ones near Chartres, Reims, and Nancy. The once invincible Luftwaffe now fought from behind its own retreat. The pilots felt the shift tangibly. A year earlier, they had flown from England and prayed to make it home. Now, they chased the enemy across his own country. Each mission ended closer to Germany. Each victory felt like a step toward the end. But victory carried its own weight. The Mustang pilots had become symbols of dominance, yet they knew how fragile life remained above the clouds. Even with air superiority, flak and ground fire claimed lives daily. The sky was never merciful. On July 27, 1944, Lieutenant George Preddy of the 352nd Fighter Group, one of the war's top Mustang aces, wrote home, "We own the air now, but it's still hell up there. Every time I roll in on a target, I can feel the flak like someone slamming their fist on the side of the plane. You just hope it's not your day." It was not bravado. It was fatigue. By mid-1944, even success had become exhausting. The airfields were crowded with the rhythm of constant sorties. Mechanics slept beside the planes. Pilots wrote letters they never mailed. Every evening, a handful of aircraft failed to return. Still, the offensive continued. By August, Allied ground forces broke through at Saint-Lô and began the race across France. The Mustangs flew ahead of them, harassing every retreating German column. Entire divisions were pinned down by air attack alone. Roads were littered with wrecked vehicles, fuel trucks, and burnt-out tanks. The Luftwaffe attempted to counterattack during the Falaise pocket battles, but it was hopeless. They managed only a few dozen sorties before being intercepted and destroyed. The last organized German air effort in France ended within days. When Paris was liberated later that month, the streets erupted in cheers, not just for the soldiers who marched, but for the unseen wings above that had made their march possible. For the German pilots who survived to reach their homeland, the view from their cockpits was one of ashes and smoke. Every base west of the Rhine was gone. Every flight now began and ended under the threat of the same pursuers who had followed them since the winter. They had nowhere left to run. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields of Poland, the P51 Mustang had completed what it was built to do: erase the Luftwaffe from the sky. But even as the Allies celebrated their newfound mastery, the pilots themselves understood something deeper. The Mustang was not just a machine of war, it was a machine of transition. It had turned air combat from an art of courage into an industry of precision. The age of chivalry in the sky had ended. Now, war belonged to those who could reach the farthest, stay the longest, and strike the hardest. And in 1944, no one reached farther, stayed longer, or struck harder than the Mustang. By the autumn of 1944, the skies over Europe belonged to no nation but one. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was now little more than a name whispered in the ruins of its own bases. And above those ruins, the contrails stretched eastward again, unbroken, endless, shimmering in the sunlight, all the way to Berlin. The American High Command had waited for this moment since the first B-17 crossed the Channel 2 years earlier. The bombing of Berlin had always been more than strategy. It was symbolism. The idea that no fortress, no capital, no ideology could stand above the reach of Allied air power. But it was also the most dangerous mission imaginable. Berlin was surrounded by layers of anti-aircraft defenses. Hundreds of flak batteries ringed the city. Dozens of fighter units still operated in the surrounding regions: JG-11, JG-300, JG-301, JG-2, fragments of what had once been a mighty defensive network. And yet, in late November 1944, the order came through the radio networks of the 8th Air Force. Target for tomorrow: Berlin. At dawn, more than 1,000 bombers lifted off from England, climbing through the low fog into clear, brittle skies. They formed up over the North Sea, their formation stretching beyond sight. And with them, escorting from the first moment to the last, came the P-51 Mustangs, the silver guardians that had turned a dream into a certainty. The German radar operators along the coast picked up the signals within minutes. The direction was unmistakable. The code words rippled through the command structure: Feindverband auf Berlin gerichtet, enemy formation heading for Berlin. In command centers across the Reich, the response was automatic but hollow. Scramble orders went out. Engines coughed to life on snow-covered runways. But the pilots were few, and their fuel tanks were half empty. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 G14s and Focke-Wulf FW 190, as that rose to meet the invaders, were old, patched together from salvaged parts. Some carried mismatched wings or unpainted panels scavenged from wrecked airframes. Still, they went. They climbed into the icy sky, contrails spiraling behind them, searching for the enemy they already knew would outnumber them 10-1. What they found, as they neared the bomber stream, was a wall of silver light. Hundreds of Mustangs arrayed in the upper atmosphere, spread across the horizon like a steel curtain. The Germans called them Höhenjäger, the High Hunters. The first wave of interceptors never reached the bombers. The P-51s dove through them in perfect formation, wings level, guns flashing. Each burst of fire tore through engines, cockpits, and control surfaces. Parachutes blossomed across the sky like pale flowers before being consumed by smoke. Within minutes, the radio frequencies once alive with German commands fell silent. Down below, civilians in Berlin looked up from streets already scarred by years of bombing. They saw the now familiar pattern: silver bombers in neat formations, smaller fighters swirling around them like wasps. They could hear the distant thumping of anti-aircraft guns, the sharp echo of explosions in the thin air, and then the rumbling descent of bombs through the cold sky. Factories, train yards, and power stations erupted in orange flame. Columns of smoke rose thousands of feet, drifting into the contrails above. In the chaos, the few surviving Luftwaffe pilots tried to reform. One group from JG 301 flying the new Focke-Wulf Ta 152, Germany's fastest piston engine fighter, managed to attack the bombers head-on, destroying several. But before they could climb again, the Mustangs fell upon them. A pilot from the 357th Fighter Group later described it. They came in hard, but they never saw us. We were higher, faster. When they turned straight into our guns. It was over in seconds. The German losses that day were catastrophic. More than 80 fighters were destroyed, many by pilots who never saw their attackers. The Berlin raid marked a final, irreversible truth. There was no sanctuary left, no altitude beyond reach, no base that could hide from the long arm of Allied air power. The Luftwaffe had not merely been defeated, it had been erased. And yet, even in defeat, individual courage remained. German ace Heinz Baer, one of the few surviving veterans of the early war, reportedly told his wingmen before a mission in December, "We fight because we are here, that is all that is left." It was not loyalty. It was duty stripped of illusion. The P51 pilots understood this too. They respected the skill of the few opponents who still rose to meet them. They knew that bravery and futility could coexist. Many recorded their admiration in post-war memoirs, not for the cause their enemies fought for, but for the sheer endurance of men who refused to yield even when the sky itself had turned against them. By the end of 1944, the statistics told the story with a finality that words could hardly match. In that single year, the Luftwaffe lost more than 16,000 aircraft. Nearly 10,000 fighter pilots were dead, captured, or missing. German fuel production had collapsed under relentless bombing. By comparison, American fighter losses were less than a tenth of that number. Each destroyed refinery, each bombed rail line, each strafed airfield tightened the noose. By the time the Ardennes offensive began in December, Hitler's last desperate gamble, the Luftwaffe could barely muster enough aircraft to support it. When they did rise to meet the Allied bombers again, on New Year's Day 1945, in the massive Operation Bodenplatte raid, they achieved a brief, tragic success. Hundreds of Allied aircraft destroyed on the ground. But the victory lasted only hours. The Mustang groups retaliated with devastating precision, hunting down retreating German planes across Belgium and Holland. It was the Luftwaffe's last gasp. After that, the sky above Germany was no longer a battlefield. It was occupation, an unbroken presence of Allied bombers and Mustangs, circling, observing, ensuring that nothing could rise again. For the German people, the sound of the Merlin engine became the sound of inevitability, a constant, distant reminder that the war was no longer theirs to shape. And for the men who flew those Mustangs, every mission now carried the quiet realization that they were witnessing the death of an empire not in speeches but in silence. The silence that follows when no one answers a call across the radio because there is no one left to fly. By the beginning of 1945, the war in the air had become one-sided to the point of tragedy. There was no longer any balance to restore, no contest to decide. The Luftwaffe still existed on paper, its squadrons listed neatly in the Reich's order of battle. But in reality, they were ghosts, underfueled, undertrained, and hunted even before their wheels left the ground. Every day the Allied formations crossed the Rhine with impunity. They no longer needed to fly in tight defensive clusters. The sky itself was theirs. The bombers roamed freely over what was left of Germany, striking anything that moved. And escorting them, always, came the silver shadows of the P51 Mustang. The once cautious escorts had become predators. Their missions now went far beyond protection. With the Luftwaffe in ruins, the Mustangs turned their fury on the arteries that still fed the German war effort, the roads, rail lines, and bridges that connected the last fragments of the Reich. From above, Germany had become a landscape of wreckage and smoke. Entire train convoys lay scattered across fields, black scars cutting through snow. Fuel depots burned for days, filling the air with oily clouds that never cleared. Columns of German troops retreating west toward the Rhine often found themselves caught beneath the silver wings that descended from the sun. To the soldiers on the ground, the sound of the Mustang was unmistakable. It began as a faint whine, then grew into a deep mechanical howl that seemed to shake the earth itself. The men would dive for cover, throwing themselves into ditches or forests, but the Mustangs were merciless. They flew low, skimming treetops, unleashing streams of 50 caliber fire that tore through vehicles and supply wagons. They struck with surgical precision, often in pairs or fours. The first aircraft would fire on the lead vehicles, trapping the column. The second would rake the length of the road, destroying everything in its path. When the smoke cleared, the column was nothing but twisted steel and silence. In one of the most haunting after-action reports of the war, an American pilot of the 354th Fighter Group described what he saw from 1,000 feet over the Ruhr Valley. The whole country looked like one big scrapyard. You could see the roads covered in dead trucks, tanks, horses, everything burnt, everything still. You didn't see movement anymore, only fire. It was the visual proof of victory and of exhaustion. By March, the Luftwaffe could no longer contest Allied control in any meaningful way. Its few remaining aces, men like Erich Hartmann, Walter Nowotny, and Heinz Baer, were exhausted relics of a vanished era. They fought with courage, but courage had no fuel. When the Allies launched Operation Varsity, the massive airborne crossing of the Rhine in late March 1945, more than 1,300 American and British aircraft filled the sky. Hundreds of gliders carried troops toward the far bank. German anti-aircraft guns fired until their barrels glowed red, but no Luftwaffe fighter appeared. The air above the Rhine was empty. For the first time in the war, the German army fought completely alone. The Mustang pilots watched from above as the Allied columns crossed into Germany, their engines vibrating through the spring air. Below them lay a nation that had once dreamed of world domination, now a patchwork of smoke, ash, and surrender. But even in the end, the skies still had their moments of defiance. In April 1945, a handful of German jet fighters, the Me-262s, took off from battered runways outside Munich and Berlin. They were the fastest aircraft in the world, the final hope of a dying air force. Their speed allowed them to outrun almost any Allied fighter in the level flight, but they were fragile, few, and vulnerable during takeoff and landing. The Mustangs adapted immediately. They waited above the airfields, engines throttled back, watching for the jets to return. As the Me-262s slowed for landing, the Mustangs dove from altitude and struck them in those last helpless seconds. It was ruthless, but war had long since abandoned mercy. On April 10, 1945, a P51 pilot named Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew of the 361st Fighter Group shot down two Me-262s in a single engagement, a symbolic moment that marked both the end of one age and the beginning of another. By late April, there was almost nothing left to fight. The cities were rubble, the roads impassable, the fuel gone. The Luftwaffe's final missions were flown not in defense of the Reich, but in a desperate attempt to evacuate civilians and wounded soldiers from collapsing front lines. Even these mercy flights were hunted down by the Mustangs. Berlin itself became a city under permanent bombardment. From above, it resembled a storm cloud turned to stone, gray, endless, and burning from within. The bombers struck by day, the British by night, the Mustangs circling between them like sentinels, ensuring no reprieve. And through it all, the German pilots who still flew did so with the fatalism of men already dead. One, captured near Magdeburg after bailing out, told his interrogators, "When I took off, I did not think of victory. I only wanted to die in the air, not in the ruins." He was 21 years old. By May 1945, when the guns finally fell silent, the Luftwaffe no longer existed as an organized force. Of its 30,000 pilots trained during the war, more than half were dead. The rest were prisoners, their aircraft abandoned in fields or burned to prevent capture. The Allies now controlled every mile of sky from the Channel to the Oder River. The war on the ground would end within days. But in truth, the war in the air had ended long before. It ended the day the German pilots realized the Americans could chase them home. From that moment onward, the outcome was never in doubt. The Mustang had taken the one thing no weapon of war should ever surrender, the initiative. And when that was gone, the Luftwaffe's fate was sealed, long before Berlin fell. Behind every polished wing and roaring Merlin engine was a man, often barely out of his teens, who carried the weight of the air war on his shoulders. To those on the ground, the P-51 Mustang symbolized speed, power, and inevitability. But to the men who flew it, the aircraft was both sanctuary and prison. For 8 hours at a time, they sat alone above the clouds, isolated by wind and static, suspended between life and death. The world below burned, but in the cockpit there was only the steady hum of the engine and the rhythm of the gauges. Most of them were young, 21, 22, sometimes younger. They came from Kansas farms, New York streets, California suburbs. They had grown up listening to the rumble of engines and dreaming of the sky. The war had made that dream real and terrifying. In the briefing rooms of East Anglia before every mission, they gathered in heavy flight suits and lined faces. A map stretched across the wall, red string tracing the route from England to targets deep inside Germany, Kassel, Dresden, Berlin. Beside the map stood the operations officer, reading from a clipboard in a calm voice that betrayed nothing of what he was sending them into. They listened quietly, helmets under their arms. The smell of coffee and cigarette smoke thickened the room. Some joked to break the tension. Others stared at the floor. Every man in that room knew the truth. By the time they returned, there would be empty seats. Then came the ritual. Engines starting one by one, the ground trembling as the Mustangs taxied into position. Mechanics saluted as the first aircraft lifted off, wheels tucking neatly beneath silver wings. From the ground, it looked effortless. From inside, it was survival measured in heartbeats. At 25,000 feet, the world turned silent. The air was thin, the light sharp and metallic. The only sound was the deep, resonant note of the Merlin engine, a sound so steady that pilots described it as a heartbeat they trusted more than their own. They flew in formations so close that each pilot could see the frost gathering on his wingman's canopy. The sky was vast, but loneliness sat heavy. The radio kept them connected, yet every voice carried the same undertone of fear. Check 6. Fuel 90 gallons. Flak ahead, 11 o'clock. And sometimes, blue threes hit. There was no time to mourn. When a plane vanished in smoke, the formation simply closed the gap. The pilots learned to live between extremes, moments of pure terror followed by hours of empty calm. The bursts of combat were brief, 30 seconds of chaos, then nothing but the wind. In those 30 seconds, they made decisions that meant life or death. A wrong turn, a second too slow on the trigger, a cloud hiding an enemy's climb. That was all it took. Some became aces. George Preddy, Don Gentile, John Meyer, Chuck Yeager, Bud Anderson, names that filled the walls of every squadron hut. But most were ordinary men doing an extraordinary job. Their bravery was not cinematic. It was quiet, methodical, and weary. When they returned from a mission, the first thing they noticed was the silence. Fewer engines landing, fewer voices in the radio chatter. Then came the debrief. Pilots wrote combat reports while still in flight suits, faces blackened with soot, eyes bloodshot from oxygen masks. Each entry was clinical, almost detached. One FW-190 destroyed at 21,000 feet. Probable second. Heavy flak over target. Behind those sterile words were scenes that never left them. The glow of tracers curving through the sky, the sight of parachutes blooming from burning aircraft, the black smoke of a friend's final descent. They coped as best they could. Some drank, some joked, others simply withdrew. In quiet moments, they wrote letters home, describing the war as something distant and abstract, sparing their families the reality they saw each day. "Dear Mom, I'm fine," one pilot wrote in February 1944. "We're flying a lot. Weather's cold, but spirits are high." He was killed the next week over Bremen. For the Luftwaffe pilots who faced them, the emotions were no less human. Many admired the Mustang's pilots for their skill and tenacity. After the war, captured German airmen spoke of the Americans with respect, even gratitude. "They fought clean," one said. "They did not shoot parachutes. They fought us like men." For those who survived, the end of the war brought a strange emptiness. They had lived by the rhythm of flight for years, And then, silence. No more briefings, no more missions. The engines stopped, and the world felt unbearably still. The P-51 pilots had achieved total air superiority, but at a cost they rarely spoke of. By war's end, over 4,500 American fighter pilots had been killed in Europe. Many of those who returned carried the war within them, the memories of frozen skies and burning contrails. In the years that followed, they went home to quiet towns and modest jobs. Some flew commercial airliners, others never flew again. But in every reunion, in every story told decades later, there was one constant: the memory of the Mustang. They remembered the way it felt when the wheels left the runway, when the vibration smoothed and the sky opened. They remembered the power of that engine, the feeling of control and chaos. And they remembered the moment when, for the first time, they realized they were chasing the enemy home and winning. They had lived inside history's turning point, even if they hadn't known it at the time. In the end, they didn't just escort the bombers, they escorted a generation out of darkness and into the modern age of air power. By April 1945, the sky over Germany had grown strangely quiet. The thunder of dogfights had faded, replaced by the distant rumble of artillery from the approaching front. What remained of the Luftwaffe had withdrawn to a handful of airfields, strips of concrete carved from forests, hidden beneath camouflage nets, guarded by fuel that no longer existed. And yet, from those dying airfields, a new sound began to echo across the continent. It was not the piston thrum of the old warplanes, but a sharp, otherworldly shriek. The cry of a jet engine. The Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter, had arrived. To the Allied pilots who first encountered it, the sight was both mesmerizing and terrifying. It was sleek, swept, and impossibly fast. In level flight, it could outrun any propeller-driven aircraft in the world. Its twin Junkers Jumo engines produced a sound like tearing metal, a mechanical scream that rolled through the clouds. For a moment, the Germans believed they had found a miracle. Even as their cities burned and their armies crumbled, the Me 262 represented hope. The idea that technology could still change the outcome, that one perfect machine could turn back the tide. Hitler himself called it the vengeance of the Reich. But vengeance requires more than invention. The jets arrived too late, in too few numbers, flown by men too inexperienced to master them. Only a few hundred ever reached combat readiness. Their engines were fragile, their fuel scarce, their bases constantly bombed by the same Mustangs that had destroyed everything else. When the Me 262s did appear, the results were spectacular. They struck from high altitude, their speed turning every attack into a blur. B-17s and B-24s that had endured years of combat suddenly faced an enemy they could barely see, much less fight. In one engagement over Munich, a single Me 262 squadron destroyed 10 bombers in minutes before vanishing into the clouds. The gunners called it like being hit by lightning. But every advantage came with a weakness. The jets were nearly helpless during takeoff and landing. Their engines took long minutes to spool up, and at low speeds, they were clumsy and fragile. The Allied pilots learned quickly. They began circling the airfields, waiting like hawks. The moment the jets descended to land, the Mustangs dove. Gun camera footage from those final months shows the brutal efficiency of the attacks. P-51 sweeping in at treetop height, engines screaming, their 50 caliber rounds tearing into the vulnerable jets before they touched down. In one of the most famous encounters of the war, a young pilot from the 8th Air Force, Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew, intercepted two Me 262s as they approached their base near Munich. He dove from 15,000 feet, closing to within a few hundred yards before opening fire. Both jets exploded in flames before reaching the runway. For that mission, he received the Distinguished Flying Cross. And years later, confirmation that he had destroyed the first operational jet fighters in history. The Me 262 had come too late to matter, and the Mustang had been there to ensure it stayed that way. By May, the jets were no longer rising. Many were destroyed on the ground, their sleek frames half buried in bomb craters. Others were found intact, abandoned by crews who had fled before the advancing Allies. To the American pilots who landed at those captured airfields, the sight was surreal. Rows of jet fighters lying silent beneath the ruins of hangars, their paint still gleaming, their engines cold. They stood as monuments to a lost idea. That technology alone could save a doomed cause. In the end, it was not speed or innovation that decided the war in the air. It was endurance. The P51 Mustang, a design that had begun as a humble British contract in 1940, had proven that reliability, range, and persistence were greater weapons than any secret prototype. It had fought from the frozen skies of northern Germany to the burning fields of Normandy, from the English coast to the heart of Berlin. It had done what no other fighter in history had done before: escorted the bombers all the way to the target and brought them home again. When victory finally came in May 1945, the pilots of the Mustang stood at the edge of a world that had changed forever. The jet age had begun. The old world of propellers and pistons, of dogfights and formation flying, was already fading. Yet even as the new generation of aircraft prepared to replace it, the P-51 refused to disappear. In the Pacific, Mustangs flew against Japan until the final days of the war. In Korea, they returned once more to combat, strafing ground targets in the early 1950s when the new jets faltered. Decades later, they flew again in foreign skies, over Israel, South America, and Africa, long after the nations that had built them were at peace. The world had moved on, but the Mustang had already transcended its moment. For those who flew it, the memories never faded. The hum of the Merlin engine remained etched in their bones. The sight of sunlight glinting off the wings at 30 feet haunted their dreams for the rest of their lives. At air shows years later, when restored Mustangs roared back into the sky, veterans would stand silent as the sound washed over them. That deep, rolling music of victory and loss. Some wept openly. They weren't hearing an airplane. They were hearing time itself, echoing backward. The P-51 was more than a weapon. It was the embodiment of an idea: that courage, ingenuity, and endurance could overcome even the most formidable enemy. It was the answer to the question that had haunted the air war since 1939: who would control the sky? And for every German pilot who once believed himself safe in his own homeland, the answer came one cold morning in early 1944, carried by the low hum of an engine that should not have been there. The day they looked over their shoulder and saw the silver wings behind them. The day they realized that distance was no longer protection. The day they understood that the enemy could chase them home. From that moment on, the war in the air was decided, not by bombs or strategies, but by one machine, one sound, one truth that filled the sky. The Mustang had come for them, and it never turned back.